Well, good evening. Thank you all. We've been having a nice chat here, fun chat here, while others have been gathering up. I'm know all of you whom I see, and or I've now introduced myself to all of you. Uh, Glad to see longtime friends and some new friends. I'm Jerry King, president of Hoosiers concerned about gun violence. Our topic tonight is countering the gun lobby's fire hose of misinformation. And this is a good time. We were talking about muting a minute ago. If you haven't already, this would be a good time to mute yourself. Every now and then, stray conversations come up, and so we'll try to head those off at the outset by getting everyone to mute. Um, the, Several of you, most of you that are with us so far, have been on our program before. I'm going to continue to click some other people in here as they come on. Um, Several of you have been on our forums before, but let me give you just remind you with a brief overview about what it is that we try to accomplish in these forums. We do these forums really with two important uh, objectives, broad objectives. We want to help our members and friends learn important, useful information that they can take advantage of in their own advocacy and their own work for gun reform, gun violence prevention. In the past, we've done forums on the fatal risks of guns in the home, especially risks to children. We've done forums in the past on preparing for upcoming sessions of the General Assembly. In fact, I expect that will probably be the main topic for our next forum, I'm guessing. So we do these forums to give people good information, but the flip side of that purpose is for us to hope to strengthen all of ours, yours, all of us together, strengthen all of our confidence with good information to be effective advocates. The more we know, the more equipped we are with good sound information, the more confident we can be in participating in the public dialogue around our issues. Tonight's program, countering the gun lobby's fire hose of information. There are a multitude of factors, of course, that we all could identify, a multitude that bear on the development of firearm policy and easy access to guns. The beliefs of our lawmakers is certainly one critical component of where we are with gun policy in Indiana. I've made the joke sometimes that in Indiana, where most of us are either Republicans or Democrats, but nearly all of us are libertarians. The Hoosiers tend to want government to stay out of their personal decisions, and so that's an issue that I think we contend with on a constant basis. The gun lobby's influence, and that's core of our topic tonight. The gun lobby's influence, and especially gun lobby political contributions to campaigns, is an important contributor to the nature of gun policy and the struggle for gun reform in Indiana. There is overwhelming support in Indiana, I think across the nation, but it's especially evident in Indiana, support for corporate profits, often over the people's well-being. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Indiana lawmakers are supportive of the gun industry. Then this issue, my goodness, the newspaper, the media is just filled. There were stories this weekend. Our good friend Anthony Beverly quoted on the front page of the Star this Sunday or the other day, just I guess maybe it was Monday, discussing his observations about the spiraling access of guns on the street. And we're reminded all the time that the more guns there are among youth on the street, the more young people feel the need for personal safety. The crux of the matter for us is what messages do we, the people, give to lawmakers? And what information do the people have to strengthen their message? So it's one thing to urge people to speak up for gun reform. It's another thing to equip people with good, sound information. And that's what we try to do through these forums. Our objective, good information, supports people's ability to speak out on gun reform with confidence. I've said that sentence now in about 3 different ways in the last 5 minutes, and it reflects how important we think it is for people to have good, sound information about what they want to talk about. The other objective, and I'll say one other objective that we have in these forums, is to continuously meet new people who want to support our efforts, which is something that you can be part of. We hope that you'll take this opportunity seriously. Several of you have been longtime faithful members of Hoosiers Concern, faithful participants in these forums, and you have the opportunity to help us extend our circle of members by talking to your friends, talking to your colleagues, inviting them to join Hoosiers Concern, inviting them to come to our forums, and inviting them to join Moms Demand Action, inviting them to jump into the fray and get involved. So finally, I want to introduce Devin. And my screen, Devin is in the upper left-hand corner. Devin, raise your hand so people will know who it is that I'm introducing right now. Yeah,
it's me.
It is you. Devin Hughes is a chartered financial analyst from the state of Oklahoma. He's the founder and president of GVpedia. That's Gun Violencepedia, GVpedia. GVpedia, Devin, I hope anything that I misstate here, you'll correct. GVpedia is a nonprofit that provides access to the largest public gun study database in existence, and GVpedia is a repository of fact sheets about gun violence and home to the facts about firearms policy initiative, a white paper on countering the firehose of falsehood, and a report titled Mass Shootings in America 2013 to 2019. Devin has been published in several media sites that you'll be familiar with: The Hill, Huffington Post, Los Angeles Times, Politico, Slate, Think Progress. Devin, maybe you'll tell us what that is, because I'm not familiar with Think Progress.
Think Vice. Progress used to be a news website. They went defunct a couple years ago, but I published with them before then.
All right. Okay. Vice, Vox, and the Washington Post. He's also the founder of Hughes Capital Management, and he's taught advanced topics in investments at the University of Oklahoma. We are delighted, proud. I was going to say something about quickly. I'm going to say something about States United, and then I'll give it to you. The way that we know Devin is that he is active in the U.S. network of state-based gun violence prevention organizations called States United to Prevent Gun Violence. States United has something like 30 state-based chapters, give or take, and that States United, we are a member of States United. They provide a great deal of shared information, support, sometimes some shared projects. We have had in the past for these forums, representatives from States United speaking on our forums in the past. Some of you will remember Jeremy Stein from Connecticut speaking at one of our meetings before. So Devin is from that same network that those other friends of ours have, where we've met those folks. So I'll stop there. Devin, we're going to spare 20, 30 minutes at the end for conversation. And there is Devin's PowerPoint.
Perfect. Hey, it worked without too much of a hitch. Thank you for the very kind introduction. As mentioned, I'm Devin Hughes, and I'm the president and founder of GVpedia. And today I'd like to talk with all of you about how best to counter the Firehose of Falsehood and what exactly is the Firehose of Falsehood. And so without much further ado, to leave plenty of time at the end for questions, please do hold your questions till the end because it's hard for me to see the chat screen while I'm in the PowerPoint. But yeah, there'll be plenty of time for questions. I hope to answer any and all of them. So first, what is a Firehose of Falsehood? To admit up front, I did not come up with the term Firehose of Falsehood. It actually comes from the Rand Corporation to describe Russian disinformation tactics that the Russian government has used when trying to invade Crimea, also Ukraine overall in the last year, and also when they were interfering with the US presidential elections and many other nefarious activities. So this is a disinformation strategy or campaign that involves four main features that oftentimes seem to run counter to traditional propaganda type mechanisms. So the first part is that it's high volume and multi-channel. So it's throwing a lot of misinformation, disinformation at you from a multitude, or what seems to be a multitude of sources. So if we think of this in the American context, you can have the NRA and its allies presenting messages on Fox News, Breitbart, the Epoch Times. Like basically, if you can name a right-wing outlet, it's probably going to be there. And it's just flooding the zone with continuous disinformation from a multitude of channels, and that's designed to overwhelm accurate information. And this high volume project is rapid, it's continuous, and it's repetitive. Like oftentimes the people behind this do not take weekends off. They're just constantly putting out this disinformation and repeating the same message over and over again, regardless of how many times it may be debunked. And it's just this constant stream. It also lacks commitment to objective reality. So oftentimes when presenting a message, we want to be as factually accurate as possible and aligned with reality. With the Firehose of Falsehood campaign, reality does not matter. What matters is getting the message across to as many people as possible in overwhelming factual information. And finally, it lacks commitment to consistency. So if a narrative isn't working out, you can completely reverse the narrative the next day to make a whole different set of points. And while that might appear confusing and like, well, why were you over here and then all of a sudden switch to this point, that seems to be contradictory. As long as the core message of like guns are good, basically, or guns save lives, guns keep people safer, that sort of message is maintained intact. The rest of it's just trying to bolster that original message. And if that requires completely reversing course on something else, the Firehose of Falsehood is more than willing to do so. Before continuing into the depths of the Firehose of Falsehood, I want to make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation, because oftentimes in the media space, these are seen as synonyms. And while they share a lot in common, there are some crucial distinctions. So misinformation is false information that is spread regardless of the intent to mislead. All of us here are guilty of spreading misinformation at some point. If I was to say like, oh, it's supposed to rain today, and it doesn't, I'm guilty of spreading misinformation. Now, that might be because I have no clue what the weather's going to be doing outside because I just stay inside all day. But it wasn't necessarily my intent to mislead, and I just pushed out inaccurate information. Now, let's say that I'm an umbrella salesman and I tell you, hey, it's supposed to rain today. You better buy this umbrella. And I know for certain that it's not supposed to rain today, or I should very well know that it's not supposed to. That's disinformation, which is deliberately created to mislead. And here, the intent of the creator of the information is a crucial distinction. So if it's just being wrong or inaccurate at the beginning, but that wasn't the intent, that's misinformation. If the information is created to mislead deliberately and then spread outward from there, that's going to be disinformation. And most of today is going to be talking about disinformation, the basically misinformation created to mislead people. So the gun lobby over the past 50 to 60 years has deployed two main fire hose of falsehoods, one about the Second Amendment and one around the idea that guns make you safer. First, let's look at the Second Amendment fire hose. So this was transitioning the Second Amendment from basically being about militias and making sure that the central government didn't disarm state militias into an individual right for firearm ownership for the primary purpose of self-defense. From 1888 to 1960, every single law review article published on the Second Amendment found that was a collective right. The individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment just really wasn't there. It was well settled that there is a collective style right focused on the militia that's referenced in the first few words of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia. During this period where there's no evidence, the NRA itself commissioned an internal study to see if they could create some way in which the Second Amendment was an individual right, because why would that be profitable to the gun lobby? And that internal study came back and said, sorry, there's no real evidence here. The NRA promptly took that internal study, crumpled it up, shoved it in the waste bin, and decided that if there wasn't evidence currently, they would go make some. And so they started funding lavish scholarships and pouring a lot of money into various law scholars and lawyers who were backed by the pro-gun lobby to start writing articles arguing that the Second Amendment was an individual right. And so from 1888 to 1960, no evidence of an individual right. From 1970 to 1989, all of a sudden we see that more than 50% of law review articles supported an individual right, though most of those articles were written by just a handful of lawyers who were directly funded by the gun lobby. And this sort of research that they were doing quickly overwhelmed the original scholars doing research on this topic, because before then it was a backwater, like it was settled law basically. And then all of a sudden a new surge of funding came about and changed the narrative. And this change was so successful that in 2008, the Supreme Court codified an individual right as what the Second Amendment meant in a 5-4 decision. And that decision was then last year expanded under Bruin, where it's an individual right to self-defense, and any sort of gun laws need to have a historical precedent, even though they didn't have, say, assault rifles back during the time of the founding. We're supposed to regulate those based off the historical tradition of problems that didn't exist back then. And so in a way, this Firehose of Falsehood campaign is already over. It won, and decisively so. And all we can basically do at this point with the Second Amendment Firehose is look back and learn the lessons from what it did and how it proved so successful. And unfortunately, the gun lobby has a second Firehose of Falsehood that it's focused on over the previous decades. And that's the idea that guns make you safer. And this sort of campaign has multiple steps to it. One of the first steps is to suppress accurate research. So back in the early 1990s, the CDC itself was conducting studies on gun violence and finding that a gun in the home greatly increased your risk of death from that firearm. The gun lobby was outraged by this, and their allies in Congress cut the CDC's funding by the exact amount dedicated to studying gun violence and warned them that if those studies continued, more funding would be lost. So the CDC was placed into the terrible position of having to decide whether to risk its funding on stuff like cancer research or to continue studying gun violence. And they decided to preserve what was left of their funding and left gun violence by the wayside. Now, this didn't mean that gun violence research disappeared altogether, but it made it a lot harder to study gun violence, and it dried up a lot of the funding to conduct these studies. At the same time, the NRA and its allies pumped money into touting discredited research. There's gun advocates by the name of John Lott and Gary Kleck are two of the primary ones who are publishing research talking about more guns, less crime, and the idea that there's millions of defensive gun uses every year were two of their main things that were being promulgated and touted by the NRA and its allies. And in doing so, they created confusion among the broader media because all of a sudden it looked like, oh, there's two equal sides here with research supporting both sides. What are we supposed to do with this? Even though the gun lobby had successfully pushed down the accurate research and was pushing up discredited research. And the end result of this is recent polls in the 2010s and present day find that around 63% of Americans believe that a gun in the home will make you safer. And around 55% or so believe that more people carrying guns in public will make them safer. And this creates an interesting dichotomy because overwhelming majority of Americans support stuff like universal background checks, extreme risk protection order, child access prevention, permit to purchase type laws. All of those have substantial majorities of support. Yet at the same time, many Americans feel that a gun is going to make them personally safer. And that belief stems directly from this Firehose of Falsehood. And don't worry, I'm going to explain this graph in just a moment. We can see this in how the gun lobby has used defensive gun use and concealed carry themes in advertising. So this study is of advertising space in Guns magazine from 1955 to 2019. Now, the blue choppy line, which has moved out into the red line, shows advertisements that were focused on hunting or sport shooting. And back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this was the overwhelming majority of advertisings. They were trying to appeal to hunters to buy hunting guns or for target shooting, stuff like that. But then in the 80s, and this really spiked in the 90s, the green and yellow lines appear. And these are advertisements focused on self-defense and concealed carry, rather than, hey, you want to have this gun to go hunting. It's you need this gun to protect yourself against your potential neighbors who might be up to no good. And we've really saw this spike and take off in the 90s, and then to present day, it's completely overwhelmed hunting and sport shooting in Guns magazine. And the authors of this paper have conducted other studies looking at different magazines, and they find the same general trend. Basically, all the focus is now on concealed carry and self-defense, the idea that guns make you safer and not on sport shooting or hunting, which was the traditional gun lobby, which has been supplanted. And this comes directly from the NRA. So the Trace, which is an online publication dedicated to covering gun violence, unearthed documents from the NRA itself and their Research and Information Division Director, Josh Savani, in 2021. And from these documents, there's these following quotes. While these laws, and these are typically the laws being pushed by the gun lobby, are intended to prevent the creation of firearm registries, they also prevent researchers from conducting accurate studies with the number and distribution of firearms as a variable. So they directly know that the policies they're pushing are also suppressing accurate research on this. And they go on further to talk about how this is why no matter the policy, our messaging continues to focus on self-defense. There is some evidence that the NRA's work to expand right to carry laws in the 90s and early 2000s helped drive public support for self-defense with a firearm. So everything that all the NRA's messaging is focusing on this fire hose, pursuing the goal of convincing people that guns in the home will make them safer, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And so this is what they're doing, and sadly, it's been working over the past couple decades. So why is this strategy actually working? And there's a couple things, broad topics. One is the inherent power of disinformation. So studies consistently show that disinformation is more powerful than accurate information. And this arises from a number of things. First of all, it's easier to create disinformation than accurate information. To create accurate information, well, first you're going to have to collect the data on a specific topic. Then you're going to have to conduct a research model to analyze that data. Then after that, you're going to have to publish those findings. It goes through peer review, and then 5 or so years later, you've produced the accurate data. For disinformation, I can go onto Twitter tomorrow, make something up like 98% of all mass shootings occur in gun-free zones, completely cook the data, and that's my morning, and I can break for lunch. And then in the afternoon, I can do it again on a different topic. And so it's just vastly easier when reality is not a burden or something that you have to strive towards to do this. Another thing on that is that reality is often complex and doesn't easily fit any single narrative. Whereas for disinformation, that doesn't matter. You can bend and twist whatever potential facts there are into something else entirely and make sure that it emotionally hits people where you want it to make sure that the message is as powerful as possible without regard to any facts that might contradict it. So it's easier to produce. It's often going to be more emotionally salient than accurate information. And therefore, it's going to be more memorable and share-worthy, because rather than sharing some complex data analysis, it's just easier to share the bumper sticker meme that supports your pre-existing beliefs. And so when it comes to the battle between accurate information and disinformation, accurate information starts at a disadvantage. The other problem is that we're dealing with an asymmetrical battle for reality, because one of the potential things that comes up is, well, if disinformation is so powerful, why not just conduct a fire hose of falsehood on our own? Facts be damned. And the problem is that a fire hose of falsehood cannot counter a fire hose of falsehood, because the other advantage disinformation has is it doesn't need to be believed in order to be successful. All it needs people to do is become apathetic or think that, oh, both sides are lying to me, therefore I'm just going to tune out. Or this messaging is super obnoxious, I'd rather pay attention to something else. Anytime that disinformation gets people to tune out or think both sides are doing this, that's a victory for disinformation. Because if nothing gets done, that's going to be helpful for the gun lobby to just be able to sell more guns. Whereas for people on the gun violence prevention side, we need to make forward progress in order to save lives. And if people are just tuning out and not becoming politically engaged because they don't know who to believe, who or what to believe, that's a net loss. So unfortunately, you have to stick with factual information, or it's guaranteeing victory for the side using the fire hose of falsehood. So what can we do to counter the fire hose of falsehood given how powerful it is? Fortunately, the research points to a number of things that can be deployed successfully at both the organizational and the personal level. First, going to look at the organizational level. So at that level, it's important to create a fire hose of truth. Basically, wherever falsehoods are being thrown out, people need to hear accurate information on the other side. Because if all somebody's hearing is disinformation, at best, they're going to tune out. At worst, they're going to believe the disinformation. So it's absolutely critical that people hear from the other side of the issue. Even if in any specific case, it's going to be a losing battle, it's still important to get that accurate information out there so people are at least aware of it. Another important thing is to deploy what's called inoculation campaigns. And there's a lot of research out there that treats disinformation like a virus. And the way to handle a virus is to inoculate yourself or get an informational vaccine. What this looks like in practice is telling people that are willing and ready to listen that, like, hey, look, you're likely to encounter this false information out there. Talk about what that false information is and why it is false. Because what happens otherwise is that the factual information will go right up against the disinformation, and then they kind of cancel each other out at best. And there was one notable study that did this looking at climate change. And they would provide a message such as 97% of all scientists think that global warming is a major problem and man-made. And then on the other side, there'd be, hey, there's this letter signed by 40,000 different scientists that finds that global warming is not man-made and not a major problem. And what this study did is it broke people into groups. The people who only heard the factually accurate message, people who only heard the disinformation message, and then people who heard both. What would happen is if you heard the accurate message, more people would believe that global warming was a problem. If you heard the inaccurate message, people would think it's less of a problem. If you heard both, people's opinions would remain unchanged, except for those more likely to believe in the disinformation, in which case the disinformation would prevail. However, when researchers went ahead and exposed people to the inoculation message, where they would warn people before, hey, you're likely to encounter this disinformation, and then they would encounter the disinformation next to accurate information, it would negate the effect of the disinformation. So people would realize the warning from earlier and be like, oh yeah, this is inaccurate information that I'm going to be seeing here, and they would be protected from it. And not only would they be protected from the specific point that was being inoculated, they would be protected from talking points around that as well. And so it so far seems to be the only major way to counter disinformation at a strategic level is this style of inoculation campaigns. Another thing that people can do is what's called deep canvassing tactics. So typical canvassing is going up to a door with your clipboard, knocking on the door. If it's not slammed in your face, say like, hey, do you have a moment to talk about so-and-so candidate or issue? List off the reasons they should support it, and then be like, do you support it or not? And then kind of go to the next door. Whereas deep canvassing kind of flips that conversation, where it's asking the other person for their thoughts and feelings on the topic before you're announcing like, hey, here's the reasons to support this. And if somebody's opposed, engage them in a conversation. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you believe that? What about this? Or providing some way for somebody to empathize with a victim of, say, gun violence in this case. And doing that causes substantial shifts in people's behaviors. And it's the only thing at the campaign level that actually does so. So stuff like campaign ads or putting signs on the highway or televised debates, stuff like that does not move the needle really. But this sort of deep canvassing where it's engaging people in honest conversations and hearing from their point of view really can sway people, and not just for that conversation, but for weeks or months afterwards. Another critical thing is to focus on at-risk populations. And what I mean by at-risk in this case are where the Firehose of Falsehood is being targeted currently. So during the pandemic and after the pandemic, the gun lobby really focused its messaging on women and Asian Americans in particular, in order to increase gun ownership in those demographics. And so it's important to devote most of the resources where the Firehose of Falsehood is going in order to help counteract it there. Because if you're focusing your messaging on a different demographic, regardless of what the case is, that's going to lead a lot of people only encountering disinformation, not the accurate information, which can be extremely problematic. And then the final thing, which is more of a what not to do, is try to avoid censorship. And there has been a tendency, particularly in left spaces over the past decade or so, to where it's like, oh, we're not going to platform these people. We're going to try to make sure that their radio shows or television shows or whatever are canceled and removed. And that way, that's going to stop the spread of this inaccurate information. But it doesn't. Like, we have the internet. Somebody who wants to find confirming information for their beliefs is going to be able to find it. And all censorship tends to really do is promote a backlash, because once you're trying to censor somebody, it's like, oh, well, people are going to think, what don't they want me to know? And then they're going to actively seek out that disinformation instead. And it's going to create echo chambers as well, where like you'll have MSNBC or CNN on one side and then Fox News and things further to the right of Fox on the other, never hearing each other's points. And that's a victory for the Firehose of Falsehood, because as long as the political gridlock remains and the status quo remains, that just means more guns are going to be sold to people who think that they need a firearm to protect themselves. And so in the end, censorship is a dangerous tactic that is far more likely to backfire than to produce the desired outcome of suppressing inaccurate information. At the personal level, and these are things all of us can do in our day-to-day lives, there's a 4-stage process that emerges from the academic literature on persuasion. The first step is circumventing tribal barriers. So tribal barriers, humans are intrinsically tribal. Basically, we love forming tribes, whether it's football teams, colleges, whether we're Democrat or Republican, whether we like swimming or don't like swimming. Like basically you take any issue, you're going to encounter tribes. Like creating tribes is fun. That's why sports are fun, or so I've heard. And people do it inherently. The problem comes is if somebody sees you as being on the other side or the other team, basically. If somebody sees you as a potential ideological threat, they're not going to listen to you. So if you take all the information that you found on GVpedia, brief plug, and elsewhere, and go onto Twitter tomorrow, or X, or whatever it's going to be called next week, and argue with somebody that's like, here's why I'm right, here's all the facts, beat them over the head with all the facts, you're not going to change a single mind in doing that, because they see you as somebody on the opposite tribe, and therefore you're not to be trusted inherently. So in order to change somebody's mind, you first have to be trusted by them. And this can come in a number of ways. So somebody who's a family member or an existing friend who differs politically, but still has trust in you, that can be a good place. If that's not already there, people who are survivors of gun violence often are very good messengers here. People who are gun owners but support permit to purchase and other gun violence prevention policies are very good messengers here. People who used to believe or used to be diehard NRA members but have since realized, wow, this was actually incredibly wrong what I was doing before. They make excellent messengers. Or just having something shared in common. Say you're both parents or grandparents who are concerned about the safety of their children. Even that can be enough to form a base to where somebody can see you as a part of a tribe, part of the tribe of parents or grandparents, or part of the tribe concerned about this and looking for solutions together. So step one, circumventing tribal barriers. Step two is exploring the beliefs and core values of the other person. It's basically just listening and having them explain where they're coming from, why they believe what they believe. And this does a couple of things. One, when people have to explain why something works or how something works, they tend to become more moderate in their proposals, which in this case is a good thing. We want somebody to moderate from, I want all the guns for self-defense, to like, well, there might be some potential issues here. They're explaining things, basically the illusion of knowledge, because in most issues, people tend not to know as much as they think they do about a specific issue. And once somebody starts explaining why or how something works, all of a sudden that can often become apparent, where it's like, oh, there wasn't actually as much stuff backing my position as I thought there was. And that can lead to room to talk further and debunk specific elements of disinformation. And also through this listening process, you learn where somebody's coming from on a values basis. So that if somebody's basically like, look, this is my God-given right to own as many guns as possible. I love the Second Amendment, and nothing you're going to say is going to change my mind on this. Well, it's good to know that the conversation's over to begin with. However, if somebody's saying that, look, I'm concerned about the welfare of my family, it takes the police too long to get to us in a moment of crisis, and it's better to have this lethal weapon in case the worst happens, and I need to be prepared to protect myself and my family. Well, then there's a conversation to be had, because that person's basing their values and beliefs around defending their family. And it becomes an empirical question at that point of whether having a firearm in the home is going to help them protect themselves and those they loved or not. And so there's going to be room there to explore those values and beliefs and illustrate that, hey, actually having a gun in the home for self-defense is not the best way to protect yourself or your family. And once you've listened to the other person explain and why they believe what they do, and just hear them out, because most people in the end just want to be heard, then you can basically approach it as exploring the truth together and building a fact-based foundation. So for the first couple things, or the first couple stages, facts aren't as important as building that sort of emotional trust and bond. But then at stage 3, that's where facts become important, and making sure they align with somebody's core value system. So you're not going to convince somebody who's, let's say, a diehard Trump supporter to completely change everything in their life and their core value system. That's not going to happen. However, you can tweak around the edges and show like, hey, we understand that protecting your family is super important. It's super important to me too. Here's the potential best ways to do it, and here's why some of the information that's been given to you in the past about the supposed benefits of firearms is inaccurate. And create a dialogue in which you're exploring the truth together and being able to listen and provide those facts. And also, knowing the facts at this stage is quite important, because if you enter this conversation and the other person has a list of disinformation that they have encountered and believe currently, and you have nothing to challenge that or explain why each of these cases is inaccurate other than just a broad, well, trust me, it's not accurate, that conversation's not going to go particularly well. You're not going to be able to change the other person's mind unless you're relatively familiar with where they're coming from, what sort of statistics are they bringing up, and why those statistics are actually inaccurate. This doesn't mean you have to memorize every single gun violence prevention statistic in the book, but having a solid basis of facts is really important to be able to carry on with these conversations. And not just knowledge of the facts themselves, but also knowledge of the disinformation and being able to recognize, like, oh, I've heard this before, here's where this comes from, and here's what precisely refutes it. And then the final stage after this sort of building together is moving the person to action. So this is after somebody already agrees with you, but it's just like, yeah, look, I agree that we should have permit to purchase, extreme risk protection orders, and that permitless carry is nuts. But I've got more important things to do with my time. To motivate somebody to action, facts once again need to be set aside. And what research finds is that one single emotional narrative, like one story of gun violence, that's particularly impactful, is the best way to motivate somebody to action, as well as donate more to a cause. And there have been studies on this where, and I think one of the main examples is helping end malnourishment in Africa. And they'll provide ads with, let's say, 100 children in the background and saying, like, hey, look, your dollars could help feed all of these children. And then they looked at how much money they raised. And then at the same time, they'd have an ad where it'd just be one child. It'd be basically the same message, except your donations could help this one specific child not be hungry. And the one child type advertisements create a lot more donations than the one with 100 children. And it's just something weird about human cognition, but a single powerful instance is going to be far more motivating than talking about the overarching problem. And so applying that to gun violence, you can focus on a single story at the end and have that motivate somebody to action. So to summarize and then open it up to questions, the problem is that we're facing a fire hose of falsehood. And the first step is recognizing that this is the problem, and also that the pro-gun lobby has basically had a 5 to 6 decade head start on this strategy. So it's going to take a lot of time and effort to overcome that head start. And the fire hose itself is high volume and multi-channel. It's rapid, continuous, repetitive. It lacks commitment to objective reality, and it lacks commitment to consistency. And the solution needs to be at both the strategic and the personal level, where we create a fire hose of truth, develop inoculation campaigns, deploy deep canvassing tactics, focus on at-risk populations, and avoid the urge to censor people. And then at the personal level, 4-stage process for persuasion, circumventing tribal barriers at the outset, exploring beliefs and core values, building a fact-based foundation, and then moving the person to action. We have a long white paper on gvpedia.org that goes into each of these in much more detail. It's under the Firehose of Falsehood tab. You can find our other fact sheets as well as study database on here. And then we also recently released a Substack newsletter, which features articles from people across the gun violence prevention movement. We've been running this for about 4 months now. But if you go to armedwithreason.substack.com, you can type in your email and subscribe, and the emails and articles will appear in your email, typically once a day, Monday through Friday. But now I'm happy and willing to answer any and all questions you may have.
There we go. There we go. There we go. I was just going to ask you to close the screen so that we could see each other. Yeah, thank you, Devin. Really, really full of good wisdom and perspective. So thank you. I am not seeing any questions in the chat box. So why don't, whoop, I'm in the wrong place. Let's just raise our hands. If somebody has a comment, you can use your human hand or the hand in the Zoom feature to get my attention. But Morton, I can see you are raising a question. You're muted, so unmute yourself.
I am now leaving myself to be unmuted.
Good.
You mentioned the gun lobby and you mentioned the NRA. They are not necessarily interchangeable. That is, I suspect the gun lobby is a large and diffused group, and the NRA, although its membership is diffused, it is a single entity. Are there other groups that we should be thinking about when we think about the gun lobby?
Yes. So, for example, there's the NSSF, which is like the National Sports Shooting Foundation, something like that. They kind of they're less out in public than, say, the NRA, but they do have a substantial influence and try to stop gun laws across the country. You have Gun Owners for America, which is kind of like the NRA, but if you think the NRA is for weak-willed liberals and you want some true patriotism, that's Gun Owners for America. There's people like the Heritage Foundation, which has a very strong pro-gun stance. You have an organization like the Crime Prevention Research Center, which is John Lott's organization. If somebody asks me about him, I'm more than happy to spend all night talking about his quote unquote research. Let's see here. There's a bunch of local and like state-based group, like there's Rocky Mountain Gun Owners that's involved in Colorado up through the Rocky Mountains, as the name suggests. Like Oklahoma has an organization called OK2A, which again is like Gun Owners for America, except if Gun Owners for America is for liberal pansies and you want true patriotism. Yeah, funny story about the OK2A organization. They're the organization that basically writes all the gun bills in Oklahoma, and their founder was featured on CNN, and in that interview he was talking about how he make sure his children have active shooter trainings in case of school. He homeschools his kids, so those active shooter trainings involve, he says something, the kids go grab the guns from under their beds, and these are kids, not like teenage close to adults, and then point them at the doors as he comes through and gives the all clear. So yeah, and oftentimes I do use the NRA gun lobby, and it might seem interchangeable. So gun lobby is basically the broad spectrum of kind of all those groups and individuals who are trying to support the narrative that guns make you safer and wanting to buy and sell more firearms. And then the NRA just happens to be the most powerful organization under that umbrella. Even though they've had a bunch of financial problems recently, they're still probably the most powerful organization of those.
Now, these organizations that you've named, starting with the NRA, are basically organizations of individuals. And I would imagine that the gun manufacturers have an organization. And I was wondering what other kinds of businesses might be part of this broader gun lobby.
So typically you're going to have gun stores. You'll have the gun shows, which can be collections of gun stores and hobbyists. You'll also have like media type organizations. The Truth About Guns, for example, is one. The Reload is one that tends to be slightly more reasonable and presents itself as more journalist focused. bearing arms, ammo land. And then you can get into the more conspiracy oriented areas like Alex Jones's organization, even though he touches other topics, like he focuses a lot on guns as well. And so basically there's an entire right-wing media ecosystem, and like the gun lobby is a very major part of that.
Let's go to David. David, you need to unmute and ask your question. David, can you hear? There we go.
Okay. Yeah, I found this presentation extremely interesting. I'm a retired professor of political science, and the first course I ever taught was on totalitarian political systems. So what you talk about sounds to me exactly like what was called the big lie. And we saw that used by the Nazis. We saw it used by communist political systems, and we see it being used now by Trump. So, the big lie on the elections is the same as the big lie on gun control. And of course, it's the same groups that's involved with all this. So in my concern and my frustration about all this, I've been working on this issue for 25 years now. I was one of the founders of our particular gun violence group, is that Americans are so incredibly ignorant and vulnerable to this kind of lie that it's almost hopeless. And in much the same way that the Germans were in the 1930s, they bought these lies hook, line, and sinker. So, I appreciate your thoughts about trying to counteract the big lie with truth, but I think we've so failed in our educational system to teach people about how to recognize truth that it's sort of a hopeless situation. So I don't know. I'm sorry to be so negative, but anyway, let me turn it over to you for a more optimistic response to that kind of situation.
Yeah, I'm not supposed to be the optimist in the room, so how dare you, number one. But
so you and I are kindred souls, I think.
Yeah, so a couple things on that. Like, one, I think there's a distinction between like kind of an overarching broad level sort of thing, is like convincing somebody in 1930s Germany not to be a Nazi sort of thing, or today, like, don't be a Trump supporter. That kind of goes to the core of identity. And that's kind of, that fight is sort of hopeless in a way, to where it's like, if somebody's bought into Breitbart, Epoch Times, watches Fox News all the time, it's going to be hard. You're not going to be able to turn them into a card-carrying Democrat. Like, so kind of lower the expectations on that, but recognize that there's still a narrative and path forward on this specific issue. Like, we don't need a diehard Trump supporter to completely negate and cast off every aspect of their identity. Like, in a way, gun violence, it is a single issue topic. And if we can get somebody to agree with us on that, they'll provide wiggle room on other potential topics, but also it's very important to have their vote on this. And one of the things that I didn't cover in the presentation, but it's in the paper, is there was this series of social experiments, I believe it was done in the 1960s, where they would have people come in and basically do these basic vision tests. And what the person didn't know was that everybody else in the room doing this vision test was in league with the person conducting the study. and they would provide like sets of 3 lines and be like, which of these lines is the longest? And they would go around the room and all the people associated with the researcher would give the wrong answer. And then would come to the person who they're actually conducting the study on, and very often they would side with everybody around them because they just didn't want to cause a scene and be like, well, obviously the longest line is the long one and not these other ones. And so that provided, and something like 50 to 60% of people would side with the rest of the group at least once on a clearly incorrect answer. So that's kind of the depressing aspect. The good aspect was in a follow-up study where they would make sure that there's one other person in the room that would say the correct answer before getting to the person who they're conducting the study on. And then that dropped the number of people siding with the group on the incorrect answer to 0. And so creating reality allies in these conservative echo chambers is absolutely critical, even if it looks like that person's going to be getting beat up intellectually on a daily basis. It's still important for that message to be heard and for people to realize that, like, hey, like, my opinion isn't like extremely out there just because I think I disagree with the group of people around me. People don't want to be socially ostracized. And so if you can provide an off-ramp to be like, hey, look, these people who are in a similar situation as you are also agree with you on this specific issue, that's going to provide wiggle room, because you don't want to cause people to feel like they have to ditch their entire identity in order to agree with you. You're not going to win that battle. But if people in their tribe agree on this specific issue, then you can basically garner movement on this and slowly work out change there. And I'm under no illusions that it's an easy process, but it's definitely a feasible and plausible process that's been done on specific issues. Like everything I mentioned in the paper is backed by peer-reviewed research. It's just the lessons from that research have to be consistently applied.
Margie, unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Devin, for the information. When you're engaging on the personal level and you have established rapport and you're having a dialogue rather than a lecture, and you get to that third stage of fact-based information, what is the most persuasive facts, in your opinion, that you can provide to someone who believes that they are safer by possessing a gun? Do you think there's one argument that's more persuasive? Well, one piece of information that's facts-based that's more persuasive than another?
So my typical go-to line, if I just have to pick one, is that a firearm in the home doubles your risk of homicide and triples your risk of suicide. And that's
Okay.
not just one study that's finding it. It was actually a meta-analysis of 16 different studies and it combined all those results and found that result. Now, that might not be enough to convince the person to be like, oh yeah, you're right. Okay, I changed my mind. But that sort of fact pattern, it's like, if you don't believe it, or somebody says, well, I don't believe that, it's like, so why don't you believe it? And just like turn the question back, or it's like, so why do you believe a gun in the home makes you safer? Like, what evidence do you have to support that? Is there any evidence that would change your mind? That's one of my favorite questions to ask, because is there any evidence that would change your mind? People go, oh, that's interesting. And yeah, if I saw this, this, or this, like I might be convinced. And then you can provide that potential data. And the other thing I tend to ask people to do is like, hold your beliefs to the same standard that you're holding my beliefs to in terms of the weight of evidence. So because people often have a much higher standard for the evidence they're being provided, it's like, oh, I want like 20 different studies all showing this and yada, yada, yada. It's like, well, do you hold your own beliefs to that same standard? And so it's like, where can we have a level standard? And then also, what evidence would change your mind? And because if somebody says there's no evidence that's going to change my mind, conversation's over. Good to know, sort of thing. But for most people, like, that's a rather unreasonable thing to say. Like, there's nothing you could say that would change my mind. Most people are going to try to come up with something. And this isn't going to work on everybody. There's a solid 20% of the population, 10 to 20% of the population that's, regardless of what you say, they're not going to be convinced. That's fine. That still leaves 80% out there. And even if you say like, oh, well, there's 10 or 20% on both sides, that still leaves a middle of 60 to 80% that's potentially persuadable on an issue. And that's a very large percentage of people. Like, if you can get something to like 80 to 20%, like, that's absolutely crushing. If you can eke out 3 to 4%, that's massive on an electoral scale. So I think oftentimes we tend to feel defeated when we look, it's like, oh yeah, we're never going to convince Alex Jones to change his mind, so why try? Well, most people aren't Alex Jones. Like, there's a broad swath of people who just aren't particularly interested in the issue of gun violence and don't hold very strong beliefs either way. And those are the people that can be reached and need to be reached, rather than trying to get the diehard mega Trump supporter to change their mind. Now, there might be opportunities to get that single person to change their mind, but there's a lot of other broader opportunities that oftentimes remain untapped.
I want to come to Steve in a second, but I quickly want, I'd like to connect 2 or 3 comments that we've heard here in the last few minutes. Devin, your response just now, talking about that movable middle, people in the middle who can be persuaded, but I'm going to go back to David's question. David, I share your cynicism about the status of belief about truth, the status of understanding truth among so many Americans. Steve's the psychiatrist among us, and so he might think that he might not like this comment, but it seems to me that a large portion of our population has this selective psychosis. They are people who manage their lives pretty well by and large, but in this one part of their lives, they're just off. And so that dealing with truth telling and truth sharing with that group is kind of hard. The point that I got off track with that. The point that I want to make is that I think that the messenger, when it comes to hearing factual information, the messenger is probably as important as the message. And I sometimes say, I'm not very impressed when I hear the Pope ask us to pray for peace. Of course, the Pope asks us to pray for peace. That's his job. And so when the Pope says pray for peace, I think, okay, I'm going on. But when ordinary people talk about let's be sources of peace, whether it's people that you know in your congregation or your neighbors or PTA or whatever, when ordinary people say, let's be sources of peace, I think that is more influential than 1,000 appearances by the Pope. So the point here that I'm getting at is that I think that observation that I just made is core to our group, Hoosiers Concerned, and for that matter, moms also. I think that our job is to try and figure out how to equip ordinary people with information that they can use and talk about. A conversation that happens with the person that you're sitting next to at church is probably more valuable than what that person is going to hear from a politician on TV. So the question then becomes, how do we as organizations expand the base of solid information outside of our members? That the 18, 20 people that are with us right now are representative kind of what Hoosiers Concerned membership is like. How do we get beyond us to equip that movable middle with information that they can talk about just because they're caring citizens. That's I phrased that as a question. I meant it more as an observation. Let me get to Steve. Steve Dunlop had a question a second ago.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little something to what you had talked about in terms of how to respond to people. And that is that numbers, I think, are interesting, but you might want to add to that. You might even say to them, you know, we found that suicides are more common in families that have guns. Why do you think this is? And the person's likely to say, well, you know, these people got suicidal, so they went out and bought a gun. And the answer to that is no, that's not why it is. Because we've shown that people who commit suicide with guns are less likely to be mentally ill, and it's more likely to be impulsive. They're more likely to be drunk. And so when a gun is around, what would be a normal thing becomes a tragedy. And for the same reason, you might say, well, they might say, well, why do you think homicide's more common when a gun's in the house? And the answer is mostly that people who live in families have arguments, and they often shoot each other as a result of those arguments when they wouldn't if they didn't have a gun. And this is particularly true for women, that women in families are especially at risk when there's a gun in the home. But I think adding something a little to it that goes beyond the numbers might help. Now, as far as calling a large percentage of the population psychotic, it doesn't really work, because the definition of psychotic has to be the beliefs that are not widely shared in the society. Otherwise, you'd have to say that everyone who is of the wrong religion, which is anyone but mine, is psychotic. So
But in their tribe, there are millions and millions of people who believe something that is patently untrue, but they conduct their lives outside of that frame in pretty reasonable ways.
Right. Well, just don't say that belief is psychotic, because it isn't.
Okay. All right. That's why we have a psychiatrist here. Yeah. Molly. Question, Molly.
Can I go ahead and answer a couple things real quick and then
go ahead, then we'll get to Molly.
Yeah, so to go to the first point, like, I definitely want to agree that the messenger is often just as important as the message. So, like, if you were to drop me into a hunting lodge in rural Wyoming with a bunch of 50-year-olds with like neck beards out to here, all wearing mega hats, and told me to convince all of them about gun violence, I probably would not be the greatest messenger there. Like, you're going to want somebody else who's been a lifelong hunter. Like, the facts wouldn't change, but the face saying them would. And now if you drop me into like a college setting, all of a sudden I'm going to be rather successful in that. And so thinking about when doing outreach as an organization, it's like, all right, who are the people I'm trying to reach in this specific case, and then pair the message with the messenger for that particular case. And then to kind of go to the second point, like, I do think that some charity to people who disagree with us is important, because all of us here are probably catastrophically wrong on 3 or 4 things, at least, like issues of how we think the world works. Like, none of us are going to be immune from making those errors. Now, I don't know what those specific errors are, but I'm sure I have them. Now, some people have those specifically wrong beliefs about topics that are of great importance, say like gun violence. But approaching it more with compassion and being like, just don't say like, oh, this person's a gun nut. Like, if you're approaching it like that, like, you're not going to get anywhere. But recognizing that, hey, we're all people who are concerned about our family's safety. Like, there can be a lot more wiggle room than people often think on that. And so I think kind of going in with that approach is going to be helpful. It's not always going to be successful, but for a lot of people it will be. And like, if everybody in this who learns these facts and messages just convinces one friend or acquaintance on this, like, you're already moving the needle rather substantially in that. And particularly if you're able to get them to become concerned about this issue and convince one of their friends as well. So it can quickly build on itself if done properly.
Molly, unmute yourself.
Good evening, and thank you. This has been a tremendous presentation, Mr. Hughes, one of the best. You seem to be yourself a model of common sense thinking and demeanor. So you must be very persuasive, I would think.
Depends on the day.
I personally think that my approach and where I find it in is to look at things like, you mentioned the at-risk groups that you're concerned about, Blacks, women, Asians after the pandemic, with the increase of sales to these demographics for guns. I can sympathize to some degree with these people because I think the whole feeling of self-reliance in this country makes all of us vulnerable to feeling like I've got to figure this one out for myself. I mean, most people who have experience calling the police in a real crisis situation usually don't have the greatest experience. And usually it's pretty ineffective, if not downright dangerous. So I totally sympathize with people who feel like we need to have protection after this incident. Asians having their families spat on, assaulted, simply because they were, you know, the ones that were everyone's fingers pointed at them as, oh, these are the people responsible for the pandemic, or Blacks in a bad situation in so many ways in America, and women, especially single women. I can certainly attest to that. So, you know, for me, that is my interest. I don't necessarily try to take on this whole thing of let us reason together and deal with it that intellectually. For me, I see and sympathize with this instinctive need to feel protecting of your family, of yourself, in a crisis situation where the institutions, like the police, have failed us. So I think, Dr. Mason, I would be angrier with the institutions than the people. And I don't think the people are as ignorant as we sometimes allow ourselves to think. I think that people are a lot smarter and a lot better than that. But that's just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Yeah, and to kind of add on to that, like it would take only like 2 general fact patterns for me to be on the NRA side. Guns being used in self-defense more than they are in crime. So basically guns have a protective benefit. And if you have more people carrying in areas, that reducing crime. Like if those fact patterns were actually true, I would be like on the other side of this issue, because it's like, hey, guns are saving lives then, but they aren't. And so like, and with the question of safety, like it definitely has broad emotional impact. Like all of us want to feel at least some degree of control in our lives and some degree of protection. And the way guns have been marketed for many years now, and even how Hollywood portrays guns, like it's showing up as both, like it's providing that sense of control and protection. And when confronting that, compassion is necessary in recognizing like, hey, everybody wants to feel safe and in control of their lives, but also being able to provide an alternative. So it's just like, that doesn't work. And somebody be like, yeah, I agree, it doesn't work, but do you have anything better? And so being able to provide options to people, like even if they aren't necessarily options that we particularly care for. So like make sure you could have a dog, you can train in martial arts, you can carry mace or some form of non-lethal thing around with you. Or even if somebody's like, I'm not going to give up guns, then it's like, all right, that's fine, we're not going to go there. But can you at least get a biometric safe to where you can store your gun safely to where it's not going to get stolen or a kid handling it, and still have it there in case of an emergency quickly? Or like rather than an AR-15, have a shotgun instead. That's not going to have the same street value when stolen or be capable of being used really in a mass shooting. So there's things people can do, and like we can meet them kind of where they're at on that level and providing options, even if we personally don't necessarily agree with them being the best option, because obviously the safest home is one without a firearm. But if somebody really feels that need, we need to be able to be like, okay, and here's the options. Here's the ability to train with that firearm to make sure you're not a risk to yourself or others. If you're feeling, or if you have symptoms of depression or other forms of mental illness, like here's the paths you can take. So making it as easy as possible for somebody to change an aspect of who they are without forcing them to change everything, I think is going to be crucial.
Let's go to Jill and then Margie.
Yes, I'm sorry I missed the beginning today, but I wanted to talk about the point of the messenger. And I think sometimes the messenger can provide, can be of a totally different group and have as big an impact as if they were part of that group. And the example I wanted to give is I had a brother-in-law that was murdered in a random act of gun violence. And more than 25 years ago, we started a program for teens in detention. And we tell our personal stories as part of that program. So they're not connected to us in any way. And I think that they can listen to us more than they can their own parents or somebody else, because we're volunteers. The fact that we're volunteers means that it's important for us to go there. It's important to those kids that we be there. Now, do they all listen to us and do they all care? Well, as we've gotten older, and we've gotten a lot older than when we started, we now are grandparents, and they look at us as grandmothers, and they give us more respect than they would if we were parents or probation officers or any teachers or any other people, because we're not part of their group, really, and because we are volunteers. And a lot of times what happens is we can bring up issues in a way that we're not saying you, or you have to, or everybody else has to do this, but we want you to know what the consequences were and how this affected me and my family and why I come here. And in fact, last week, the last 2 weeks, we've had a program about bridges, which has been really interesting. And as part of this program, two of the kids, there were only 4 boys, and they said, well, they just didn't trust anybody. There wasn't anybody that they trusted for their bridge, to build their bridge as a support. There wasn't anybody. And we said, well, do you trust us? And they said, they'd seen us for several weeks, in a row. Well, what do you mean? I said, well, do you trust us to come? Well, you missed the last 2 weeks. Well, that was true. We did. There were health issues. And so we recognize that as part of our program. We now ask that if for some reason we can't be there, that the guards say, they're not here because of this. So trust is a really weird thing. Well, do you trust us to give you an interesting program? Yeah, we do. And so I think that sometimes somebody that is not in the group that you would think could have an impact on these kids. We don't know why these kids are here. The other thing that we say to them, which I think makes a difference to them and possibly could to a lot of other people that you don't agree with and that you don't really know about, is to say, we see the best in you. We don't know why you're here. That's one of our rules. We don't want to know. And one of the kids said, well, if I told you, you wouldn't like it. I said, well, if I told you about some of the things I've done, you probably wouldn't like that. We all make mistakes. We all have problems, but we know these kids are going to get out. And when they get out, we know that either they'll make better decisions or they'll make worse decisions, right? And knowing that somebody actually does trust in them, does believe in them, does think that they can make better decisions may not necessarily affect whether they would shoot somebody or they wouldn't shoot somebody, or they would carry a gun or not. But I think what they would do is think more. And I think that there's so many kids and adults, clearly, who are just disenfranchised, not part of a system, don't have a group of people that trust them, are afraid, are nervous, have made mistakes, think they're going to be locked up forever. But the fact is they're not. They get out. People get out. And when they get out, then if we don't show them any other way to think, they have no other way to think. They will do what they've done because that's what they know how to do. And so it's a really interesting program, Options. I would be happy to talk to anybody about it. But I think the most important thing that we do is go in there, not know what these people did. They may have done some horrific things, and say, we know that you can do better, because we all can do better. We know you can make good decisions. And part of our group rules lay that out as to, we want discussion to be legal and positive. On the other hand, I will tell you that guns are really attractive to them. And so we were talking about what $5 could buy in 1840. And there was a list of Montgomery Ward of all the different things they could buy. And a couple of the items referred to guns. And so immediately these guys glommed, oh, wow, did you see that? Oh, you could get this for this and this for that. Of all the things that you could get in there, they zero out. They're boys, they're teenagers. They see it in movies. They see it on TV. It's exciting. It gets their interest. So,
Yeah, thank you, Jill. Thank you. If you did, I want to encourage anybody who didn't get a chance to see Anthony Beverly's the story that quoted him extensively in the Star the other day. Look, find that article. It was really insightful about the attitudes among young people about guns going.
Carrying guns to school. Yeah, I did. And yeah, I thought that was good.
Yeah, let's go to Margie, and this needs to be our last question.
Yeah, I will be just very brief, because Devin actually included this in his conversation about, if you can't persuade people, perhaps you can offer them an alternative. And one of the things that Moms Demand Action in Everytown for Gun Safety supports wholeheartedly is safe storage. And it's something you can offer to people who are not going to give up their guns, but you can be persuasive, perhaps, that as an alternative, you use gun locks or use gun safes, and you store your guns separately from your ammunition. And it's an alternative that does appeal to some gun owners.
Yeah, and any gun owners whom it appeals to, that's a victory in itself.
Yeah, we consider that a win.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Devin, my goodness, thank you so much. This has been one of the most stimulating conversations we've had in our forums. We have good conversations each time, but tonight the participation in the conversation was enthusiastic, full, and just really a fine discussion. Yeah, thank you. I see some thumbs up and nods and smiles. So Devin, thank you. This has been a really fine evening. Abby,
thank you for having me here.
Camera. Abby, I'm going to say something about you in a second. Raise your hand, your physical hand. There you go. That's Abby. Abby Hain is our new communications intern, and I'm going to connect introducing her to what I started to say before she turned her camera on, which is we're going to ask Abby to post the video that we've been recording here. We post our videos on our website, and they're easy to find, and so I hope that some of you will go back, and for that matter, invite others. You can tell your friends, wow, I was in the most interesting forum the other night. The video is on the Hoosiers Concern website. So that would be something good for you to do. We have not selected. I said at the beginning of this meeting that I think it's very likely that our next forum will be probably in December. We haven't nailed it down, but I think that's probably what's going to happen. And our December forums are usually focused on getting ready for the next legislative session. So that is likely to be the December forum, but you'll hear more about that as we come up to it. Last thing, I always make a point. Several of you are, as I look across the screen, are already members of Hoosiers Concern or maybe of Moms. I hope if you're not a member that you'll join us and that you'll ask your friends and colleagues and neighbors and family members to join our organizations. I think we're through. It's been a fine evening. Thanks again to Devin, and watch for upcoming announcements. So with that, I'll say goodnight.